Hello, everyone. Happy St. Patrick's Day. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and I have the pleasure of having Cheryl Urbanczyk join me today from Learn Literacy in Ontario. And we've decided to get together to discuss some of the terminology that comes up in the Right to Read public inquiry report, because we recognize that not everyone's familiar with these terms, and it makes it difficult to comprehend or understand what it's really saying. So it's important that we have an understanding of the language that is being used in the report. So I think we formally called this the Right to Read inquiry and systematic, explicit, direct instruction. But before we go into those first three terms, I think it's important that we lay a foundation of a couple other terms. Now, as just a heads up, we do plan on making these into smaller videos where you can just look at a term, and those will be available on the Right to Read Initiative YouTube channel for you to reference in the future. So if there is a little bit repetitive or a little bit awkward in some places, just realize that that's only because we want to make sure that these smaller videos make sense as a standalone feature. So the Ontario Human Rights Commission launched a public inquiry into reading, and the report was released at the end of February. This report has huge impact on how we can make education systems better across Ontario, across Canada, and in the larger world when it comes to reading instruction. And it's important to note that these recommendations don't just have to do with English reading instruction. We're looking at how the brain learns to read. So thank you so much for joining me today, Cheryl. Do you want to take a moment to say a little bit about who you are and your background?
Thank you, Kathryn, for inviting me. It's great to make connections and talk about this stuff. I could talk about it all day, so it's great to spend time together. So I've been in education as my career since I started teaching over 2 decades ago, and have taught in many different types of schools, private and public, across grade levels, elementary to high school, and got into administration, and again was an administrator in private and public schools. Currently, I'm a vice principal in one of the public boards in the Greater Toronto area. And the Right to Read is near and dear to my heart because my daughter is dyslexic. And so, like many people who get into this work, you find through your training, you do not have this to teach your own child. So I studied Orton Gillingham, and I'm currently a fellow in training with the Orton Gillingham Academy, and also have my structured literacy dyslexia specialist qualification through IDA and CERI. And I do training and tutoring and a lot of advocacy work through my platform, Learn Literacy.
That's amazing. Yeah. And that's the thing. I find a lot of the passionate people in this field have a personal connection to someone who is a struggling reader. For me, it was myself. I'm severely dyslexic, and I do have a child with dyslexia. And the right to read is so important. We need to make sure that we shift from how we're currently, or a lot of the curriculums and boards are approaching instruction, that's excluding several of our students that need a more explicit nature to their instruction. So currently, a lot of the programs when it comes to language arts are discovery-based or inquiry-based learning. And that means that we are leaving it up to chance whether the students are going to get the concepts. We provide them with these wonderful literacy-rich environments and read these wonderful texts and hope that they're able to pick up on the skills. But that doesn't necessarily happen. And if it doesn't happen, that's when we need to make sure that there's the instruction.
Right. Yeah. So, you know, the concern is that young children really aren't the best at teaching themselves. That's been my experience as a classroom teacher, as an administrator, as a parent, an advocate, almost all the boxes, right? And we expect to be taught the things we need to know. And if the most foundational skill in school is not explicitly taught, if children don't pick it up on their own, the consequences are quite dire. And we can't arrange a program or methodology or pedagogy around those who can learn to read on their own, because there's always that segment of kids who can learn math on their own or with minimal instruction can just kind of pick it up. But that's not the way we should design the system. The system should be designed to ensure that all children get the teaching they need to be successful at what they need to do.
Well, and I think it's important to highlight that we now know, and we have concrete evidence from imaging studies, that learning to read isn't a natural process. It does not occur in one part of the brain. And the parts of the brain that we have to connect to become fluent readers are not ones that have the connections automatically or pre-wired built in. So when we're doing discovery-based reading, we're not making sure these connections are made. So there are some students that are able to make those connections on their own, but we need to make sure that we provide the assistance to the students that can't. And that's where we see that we need direct, explicit, systematic instruction. Right. Now, one of the founding things that we need our students to understand is the alphabetic principle, or having knowledge about the alphabet. Why don't you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the alphabetic principle is understanding that the alphabet codes for sound, right? And these letters are just arbitrary symbols that are linked to speech sounds. So there's, we know the letters of the alphabet, but that's a good place to start. But what can be confusing to people is that our language system is not necessarily built on a one-to-one correspondence between one letter and one speech sound. And so starting with the alphabet, let's say just, maybe the traditional way, let me do a letter of the week type system where, we have letter A, it's the sound A, do my activities. Next week, it's letter B. That's just the kind of the tip of the iceberg. So it's very important that children have this understanding of our speech sounds are connected to symbols in print. And that's what the alphabetic principle is.
Yeah, and then going from that, it has to do with concepts about print and understanding that there is directionality when it comes to reading. You don't read it top to bottom, or you read it top to bottom, left to right, but it's not like you're reading down a column. We're reading across rows. Not every language does that. That's so right. Especially when we're working with students that are have English as additional language, we need to acknowledge that the writing system that they may have exposure to at home doesn't have the same approach to reading. Maybe it's one where you read in columns, or it's one that you read right to left. And an interesting thing to note, so we read, one line, start back at the beginning, but way long ago, the Greeks went zigzag, right? And the reason why I like to mention that has to do with when it comes to reversals. And it's important that we understand that that is a natural thing for kids to have. And it's because we want to be able, or it's important for us to see things symmetrically and recognizing that a face that's a mirror image is the same. But we need to have students learn and readers learn that letters are not these things that can be viewed this in different ways and represent the same thing. And it's the same thing when it comes to reading words and printing our name. So this is a concept that they need to develop in those early stages. And they may need support, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a learning disability if they've struggled with it.
That's so true, because those reversals are part of a normal developmental process, and you see that spill into things like numbers written reversed and so forth. It's just, the brain is trying to fix that visual imagery in space in a certain orientation. And, the worry is, I think, how excessive it is, and if it seems to carry on beyond what might be considered the normal developmental time frame for that to be happening.
Definitely. Now, we've touched on it a little bit, but there's this big term that's super important, especially in the early years, and that's phonological awareness, which is the awareness of speech sounds. Now, anyone who can comprehend knowledge has an unconscious phonological awareness. So if they can discriminate between words that sound alike and understand sentences is more than just a blurred sound, is actually has meaning, then they have that phonological awareness. But when it comes to learning reading and writing, when we're taking those speech sounds and finding another way to represent them, we need to make this conscious knowledge. And some students don't have a problem with this, while others do. And it's important that we make sure instruction includes phonological awareness, and we screen. So we take the time to work one-on-one with every student in those lower levels to see how their phonological awareness is, because those are skills that we can work on effectively and efficiently before reading instruction helps. And when we introduce reading instruction, it can often help with the conceptualization for it. So we shouldn't keep it apart.
Yeah, I think, that's where understanding what terms mean is so important, because phonological awareness, I think, is used to represent many things. But the way I see it is it's the umbrella term for all of the sound structure within our language. So for example, syllable, rhyme, alliteration, counting sounds or words in a sentence, and phonemic awareness. So phonemic awareness is, big right now, but that's only one small component of what the phonological awareness concept is. So if we think of that whole awareness is all of the sound structure in our language, that's great. And then phonemic awareness is understanding the sound structure within a word. And that's where, like your Haggerty programs or Kilpatrick, or, can you say instead of sip, and take away, add like that type of activity can really promote those awarenesses and understandings. So I will add a caveat, like my experience is like kids with dyslexia have a hard time with rhyming and counting syllables. So, there should be that understanding that that's how we can assess kids and look for red flags, so to speak, if they're not progressing well on these tasks and understanding and hearing these sounds. And the other caveat I will add is, I think for our multi-language learners or ELLs, the specific teaching of what to hear is really important, because the sound system of their language is very different. So some of these approaches might have to look maybe different than you would use for other children, let's say.
Well, and even dialects and accents come into play.
Yeah.
Right? I know in my home, my partner has a British upbringing and an English accent. So words that would rhyme for me don't necessarily rhyme for him. So if I say garage, that can rhyme with mirage, but he says garage.
Yeah.
And that doesn't rhyme with mirage, right? Yeah. So it's understanding those things. And when we look at those purchase programs, which have great use, but you also can't just use it blindly. That's right. And take into and acknowledge the way that the local language speaks and how you as an instructor or a teacher speak compared to the student and how the word would be said at their home. Yeah. So that's an important thing to do. And the one thing that I definitely wanted to mention is when we screen for phonological awareness and phonemic awareness, we're not diagnosing, we're identifying risk. And research has repeatedly shown that early intervention in this area pays off so much. And that's where we need the direct, systematic, explicit instruction to help these students have the awareness of sounds, especially when they're ones for, again, those English language learners or the English as additional language, where the phonemes may not be the same. And I mean, one example that I like to think about is how there are languages that are tonal, but English isn't one of them.
Yeah.
So that's something that as a native English speaker, you may not even consider or recognize the difference. But someone with Chinese, as a Chinese first language, it has a big difference into the pronunciation.
Yeah, like I would almost liken that maybe to accent, you know, retire or retire. You know, some of these things, yeah, there's so many things about language we kind of
take for granted.
Take for granted, thanks. I was trying to look for the right word. Right? And it's not, you know, unless you have the awareness of it, you don't know. So it's not as if people can't understand. It's just many people haven't been taught. You know, it was never part of my teaching when I was learning. And so I had to learn all that when I gained the skills to teach my daughter, you know, through Orton Gillingham and lots of other types of training things that I've done. So then you're like, oh, okay, that's what that is.
Well, and as a teacher, especially if you're in those earlier elementary years and even the early childhood years, you can notice the students that struggle by just listening to their speech. Yeah. And the pronunciation of words. And that's why, you know, as for parents, it's so important not to imitate the way they say words. So if they say lello, you don't want to say, oh, get the lello blanket or whatever. You want to make sure that you're saying yellow. So because as they're learning language, they're learning to mimic and imitate. But if they're hearing it incorrectly from you, they can't correct it.
That's true. Yeah.
So another concept that I wanted to discuss was automaticity, because this is very important when we're looking at any type of instruction, because it means that it can be done without a lot of effort, a lot of working memory, and it allows you to do things easier and focus on other aspects. So when we're talking about automaticity in our, you know, alphabetic knowledge, so, and they say the alphabet, can they identify which letter represents which sound? And we want it to be so it's automatic and they don't have to think about it. And for some students, that takes scaffolded instruction and repeated practice. There are kids that you need to tell them once or twice and they get it. You don't need to do it again. But then there are those students that need it over and over again with the support to understand it.
True. Yeah, I think, you know, when understanding automaticity, we want to get to it's related to fluency in my mind. You know, our end result is fluent reading, which is one of our 5 pillars from the National Panel Report and this type of thing. So when people think of fluency, they think, let me get that passage, let me time it. Okay, that's great. That's your end product. But so many things has to happen before that. There's fluency with letter naming, like you said, fluency with sounds, right? Can you see a grapheme or a letter and make the sound right away? There's fluency in your blending. How quickly can you blend a consonant, vowel, consonant word or a nonsense word? If you're, you know, how quickly then can you put those words in a sentence? So there's so many factors that go into fluency. Where exactly is the child needing that teaching and support? It starts right away at the very beginning with that quick letter naming to sounds, giving the sounds like flashcards, blending and sentence reading, and then you can get to your time passage. I think, you know, our rethinking of fluency is very critical from this point of view as we're going into these steps of like direct teaching and understanding how to break things down to teach kids the skills that they need and to make sure that they're successful at each one of those before moving on to the next skill.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
So let's focus on those 3 terms that we had in the title.
Mm-hmm.
So what is meant? What do we mean when we're talking about direct instruction?
Direct instruction is kind of, basically you just tell people this is this. It's the exact opposite of discovery learning. You are very clear, you explain, you maybe do an old-fashioned, you know, lecture, age appropriate, of course, obviously for younger students, maybe a minute or 2 explanation in a small group, or a PowerPoint slide for the class is your direct instruction. But you're very clear, this is this. You're breaking things down into steps. You are not leaving things to chance. You're giving clear examples, some demonstrations, modeling, and including, you know, that concept of the gradual release of responsibility, where I do something, I show you first, we can practice together, and then you end up practicing on your own when you know, when the together practice is finished, so that you can do it independently.
Exactly. And that's where we see that scaffolded instruction and practice in place when where the direct instruction is when I do it. The scaffolded instruction and practice is when we do it together. And then we slowly remove the supports so they can do it on their own.
Yeah, it's the exact opposite of what you mentioned at the beginning about discovery learning. You know, the instructional time is so precious. There's so many things that eat away at instructional time on any given school day for a whole number of reasons. So we want the biggest effect for our time, right? We want to ensure that we can have instruction that meets the needs of the child quickly and efficiently. And this is what's needed, especially in the literacy classroom.
It doesn't leave it to chance. It doesn't leave the learner to chance. And ultimately, it allows the class to move on to the next concept faster with everyone at the same level of understanding.
Yeah.
So explicit instruction means that we're making it very clear what we're saying. So again, that's the opposite of the discovery or inquiry-based learning. We're not leaving it to chance. Now, systematic instruction means that we're teaching with a purpose.
Right.
And one example that I like to use is when we're teaching phonics or the relationship between the graphemes, which are the letters, the symbols that we use to represent sounds or phonemes in spoken language. Now, some teachers do start at the letter A and go through to the letter Z alphabetically, which makes sense if you're looking at the alphabet. But when we look at how frequently the letters are used in our language, we want to make sure that we can get students reading independently as quickly and effectively as possible. So it's important to realize that maybe teaching the letter Q and Z isn't, the 26th, like you want to look at order. And it's also important to notice that the English language has between 40 and 44 phonemes, depending on the dialect and accent, and that our alphabet has 26 letters. And so we can't possibly represent all of the speech sounds in the English language by just one letter. Sometimes we're going to have to use a digraph, which is 2 letters, a trigraph, which is 3 letters, and we're also going to have to double up on the sounds that a single letter, digraph or trigraph, can make. And this is where I find that things aren't done to the level in a lot of classrooms that I like. So what I'm trying to say, I guess, is, do you teach the letter NG as a phonics thing? And a lot of classrooms, I don't see that. So when they're sounding out a word like sing, it's s-e-ng. Well, no, it's not ng, it's ng. That's one phoneme that's represented by 2 letters. It's a digraph. And so we need to explicitly teach that, just like we would teach the sound as TH. And we need to have that systematically taught throughout before some of those less frequent letters.
That's so true. And I think when we think about what systematic means, it's a system, right? And if you are working from the point of view where you were taught in your teacher training that literacy is a discovery-based system, that kind of means there's no system. That's how things are kind of taught as you see a need, or if the child is struggling with it, you kind of wedge in these mini lessons or something like that, which could be different for one set of students or another set of students. But, working with the system means you have, a good scope and sequence of your phonics skills to work with that do move from simple to complex, and understand that concept of frequency as well, how often something occurs as opposed to how rarely it occurs, and really what are our graphemes in our print. For example, Q and U should always be taught together, right? Because Q never exists in an English word on its own. So, now that we have the right to read coming out and that concept of things being systematic, we need to ensure that, let's say, whether it's from your board level or ministry level, somewhere, somehow, that there's a good scope and sequence for people to follow to teach these phonics skills, to ensure that you've gotten through what you need to learn to be able to decode. This way, it's not like a guessing game that, oh, they didn't appear to need that, so I didn't teach them, because maybe they memorize that whole word as a unit instead of understanding the graphemes in it. So that guide for teachers is really important, because once you have that, then you can work on supporting staff with understanding this type of teaching and way of teaching and how to teach these graphemes.
And it means that teachers can assume a certain level of competency when they get students from a previous grade, and that a student who is in Toronto is going to have the same foundation of phonics knowledge or the understanding of the relationships between the letters and the sounds that they represent as a student in Kingston.
Yeah, that's right. Like we would for math. I mean, some of the other curriculums are very clear and detailed about the exact learning outcomes, like science or social studies. But that type of scope and sequence isn't, let's say, in our Ontario curriculum. We know it's being revised. The ministry did release a letter outlining their response to the OHRC report. So the curriculum is being revised. I'm hoping something like that is going to be added, and it's just not left up to each board to kind of figure out, oh my gosh, what's my scope and sequence for teaching these things?
Definitely. And I mean, the way that we need to make sure that we're not just teaching things like phonological and phonemic awareness in isolation from phonics instruction, because they are tied together in how we use them.
Yeah.
And what we want to teach students when they are reading and writing is to decode and to encode. Decode means that we are looking at the letter, identifying the sound that it represents for each letter in the word, and then blending them together. When we're encoding, we're asking the student to hear the word and then decide the sounds in the word and which letters represent them. And again, this is something that we can do explicitly with a systematic framework, so that we go from simple words that have a vowel consonant or a consonant vowel consonant structure, so that they start simple and move to the complex. So at the beginning, one of the scope and sequence that's very common, and there are a lot of resources available, is starting with the first 6 letters, SATPIN or SATPIN. Yeah. Now with those 6 letters, you can create or you can spell more than 40 meaningful words that should be in these students' vocabulary, that they'll be able to recognize when they hear it and understand when they're seeing the words and blending them, say them. But they're also words that if you break them into their individual phonemes, like at, they're going to recognize that word. It's not a new word that we're going to have to add to their vocabulary, right? So it's going to help them be able to add that to their sight vocabulary, words that they can recognize within an instant, because they already know it and understand it.
Yeah, and it gets to the reading process so much faster as well. Like if, again, maybe, I don't know what the right word is, let's say the old-fashioned letter of the week, well, you have to wait 26 weeks potentially before you might start introduce reading and blending. Whereas with SATPIN, once you get through some of these letters, you can do words and introduce blending and practice with that right away. So.
Well, and if you're doing it 26 letters, you're not going to be able to read the word "the" for a very long time.
Yeah.
Because
yeah. No.
Right, when you're blending those sounds together. Yeah. And we want to make sure that we're going to give these kids success as early as possible. And doing this is going to, so there's an infographic out there called the Ladder of Reading and Writing, and it shows a ladder and the different levels that students have ease at achieving reading. So the kids at the top of the ladder have a really easy time and aren't, some of them aren't going to need that instruction at school because they come to school already reading based on what they've learned at home and on their own. Now, when you're in the middle of the ladder, you definitely need a little bit of help, and that's going to address this. But at the bottom of the ladder, these kids have to have this. And when we start from the beginning with this and don't make them guess or look at pictures or use some of the other cueing methods where they're drawing their attention away from the sounds and what's on the page, the written word, then we're going to have the ability to help them and support them from the beginning.
Right. The mental health and wellness piece is so critical here as well, because oftentimes, you know, young children, when they can't teach themselves, often assume that there's something wrong with them. They don't have the brain power, the wisdom, or the understanding that, okay, maybe the classroom's not meeting my needs or the teacher has to differentiate. They just assume, well, everyone else got it and I didn't. There must be something wrong with me. And for kids who struggle in school, this self-esteem piece is so critical because it doesn't take long before that's actually harder to help a student with than to remediate their academic concerns, because that's so internalized, that concept that I can't do it because they've been expected to teach themselves.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we like using when we're doing this systematic direct instruction of phonics, where grapheme phoneme correspondences, so the relationships between the letters and the sounds, is giving them texts that they have been explicitly taught the skills to read. And those are called decodable text or controlled texts. So the 90 to 95% of the words that they're going to come across in those books, they have the skills to understand. And when we start this early, we're setting them on a path for success. Now, we're not expecting them to only be exposed to decodable text in the classroom. But when we're teaching and working on those beginning reading skills, we want them to have the opportunity to succeed so they can build that confidence.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So, it's how, when you think of the learning process, everything goes in baby steps, right? If you learn how to swing a bat, there's t-ball where they put the ball on the top of the pylon and then you hit it, and that's an aid. Or there's training wheels on a bike. I mean, there can be a million analogies. Those little water wings for swimming, that's how decodables can be used and should be viewed, as it's an integral process in the learning process. But I think sometimes, people who may not have a good understanding of what real structured literacy looks like in terms of the whole learning block might think, oh, phonics, it's like a worksheet and a boring decodable reader for 90 minutes. And that's completely not the case. So the decodable readers serve a very important purpose in the learning process so that there's successful practice. Imagine practicing something, getting a book with all the sound symbol associations in it, and you haven't been taught all of them, and trying to practice successfully on them. That would be very disheartening. And you wouldn't be able to get to that automaticity because you are not having successful practice. So the role of the decodable is important. And there's, any classroom should have a variety of them too, so that, you don't read it a couple times and kind of memorize it. But they're so important because that they build confidence, they allow for successful practice, and build automaticity, build up that fluency.
And while we're working on these skills in reading, we also need to work on them in writing at the same time. So once you have that SatPin knowledge, or whatever scope and sequence you're following, SatPin isn't the only one. It's just one that's commonly out there. And there are numerous free resources and decodable texts available for it. So you can do those exercises where they have their little whiteboards or their chalkboards, and as a class at the carpet, you do a little spelling activity, right? And doing that and pairing it together helps with that fluency of reading and helps that spelling instruction at the same time. So structured literacy isn't just focusing on reading, it's focusing on writing as well. And it's not just focusing on the primary years. Structured literacy can be included across the lifespan. I mean, I'm still learning things about etymology and morphology and phones themes. And I find it fascinating. And there's a structured way that you can do it, and then things just make sense. So this instruction can continue to the intermediate and high school grades.
Oh, it has to, because, learning to read is just the first step, right? Once you have your, however many graphemes, the 44 connecting to those phonemes, that's just step one. Like, what about all your academic and content words? We often see kids starting in grade 5 and 6 just kind of really getting into a slump because they lack basic skills. Maybe they were able to compensate, they learned to read okay enough to get by, but then boom, academic language overtakes them in science class, math class, social studies. Multisyllabic word reading is its own skill, right? And so it's across the age span, but like through the content areas as well, because that academic language is so key. So advanced decoding, advanced structured literacy practices there are crucial as well.
Yeah. And in that 90-minute lesson, we're also going to work on having things that address the comprehension side of things. And at the beginning, in the early instruction, we're separating the language comprehension from the teaching of reading so that we can still work on giving them the skills that they're going to need to understand how to take information from what they are reading. But we're scaffolding it so that we're doing it orally first and helping them on the way. They have, those activities where you read a story and then there's a whole bunch of pictures that you have to order for sequencing. Those are activities that are part of a structured literacy program. Talking about, capitals and punctuation, learning the syntax and semantics of a language. That is part of structured literacy. And when we're talking about structured literacy, when we're focusing more on the reading aspects, it's helpful to be familiar with the simple view of reading, which is that reading comprehension, which is what honestly most people think of when we're talking about reading and being able to read a book. It's that you can read the book, understand what you're reading, and take information from it. So when we have instruction that is working on language comprehension, we're working on part of that equation. So in those early years, when we're doing those activities, that's part of working on the skills they're going to need for reading comprehension at higher levels. More of the focus is working on the word recognition side of the equation, because that's an essential skill that needs to be mastered in order for them to be able to be skilled, competent readers.
Yeah, that's true. So that simple view, that simple view of reading is decoding, plus comprehension equals successful reading. So how that looks in terms of what you do in each component is very different across grade levels. And, oral comprehension, we all know how important oral literacy is. So, people who emphasize, but I like my literacy rich classroom and our read alouds, and, these have a very strong place in a structured literacy classroom because we want kids to love to read. We want them to love books. We want them to hear great stories and learn about all these things. But there's that understanding of, wait, we have this skill component that has to be there, and we'll have a focus that looks very different, moving forward, right, in our curriculums and practice than it did in the past to address this.
And, it's still extremely important for teachers to take the time to read novels, books in a structured literacy classroom, because then you can focus on the oral comprehension, and you recognize that a student's language comprehension or oral comprehension of the language and reasoning skills is at a higher level than their reading skills.
Yeah.
And so it gives you the opportunity to focus on those skills at their level of oral comprehension, as opposed to just focusing on their comprehension of something that they can read there on their own.
Yeah, that's so true. Because we know, like, if children are not fluent at decoding, that whole process slows down. So by the time they get to the end of the sentence, they forgot what was at the beginning because they're still not yet automatic. So yeah, that oral language piece and listening. Plus, we all enjoy listening to stories. It's fun.
Yeah, it's fun. You know what? Honestly, we've started listening to audiobooks in the past couple of years in the car and all of our traveling.
Yeah.
And I have young children, so we're listening to a lot of the classics, and it's really enjoyable.
Yeah.
And we're all enjoying it as a family.
That's great. Yeah. And the other thing is you can also clue into if they're not having a good oral listening comprehension and assess that way too, because some children may not be able to have that strong oral comprehension, and they can get support that way as well.
Exactly. And when we're looking at struggling readers, it's important to realize that there are struggling readers who are fine at the decoding and the word recognition side of the equation. Right. Their struggles happen in the comprehension. And that's why it's so important for us to understand a student and their skills before just throwing them into an intervention. Because if the intervention isn't focusing on the skills they need help with, it's not going to help them.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where our knowledge and understanding is so important. It's oftentimes reading, I kind of liken it to that puzzle pieces. There's so many puzzle pieces. So if someone's not reading successfully, is it decoding? Well, okay, what part of decoding? Is it comprehension? Well, what part of it? Is it the vocabulary, the background knowledge, the logical thinking? So it's once you start taking things apart, there's so many other layers to consider for each student in their complete skill set.
Well, thank you so much, Cheryl. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Those of you,
thank you.
Is there anything that you'd like us to address that we've missed? Or is there anything that you're thinking that we should highlight?
No, I think we, had a good conversation without, overwhelming people. I think we're looking at a huge process of change management and kind of understanding that we can take little baby steps moving toward something new and better, and understanding that as new learning becomes available, our practices can shift, and it's not a reflection of me as a teacher because I did what was taught to me as best practice at the time. As I'm getting new learning, I can shift my practice and keep moving, keep taking in new learning, getting some help and support from boards. Hopefully boards provide resources and training to help people with this direct, explicit, systematic instruction.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Cheryl, for
thank you.
Taking part of this conversation. And I look forward to speaking with you in the future.
Same here, Kathryn. Thank you so much. Take care.